one story at a time. We are your trusted news source for real facts, real stories, real perspective, and real-world news that really matters. You have tuned into 2realnews.com's Daily Headline News with your hosts, Seth Davis and Jason Boss.
Breaking out of prison, one mind at a time.
We are the 2realnews.com
Broadcasting team.
and we are going live in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome to the 2realnews.com headline news. Today is Friday, May 1st of 2015. I'm Seth Davis.
And I'm Jason Boss, and these are the headlines for today.
In U.S. news, report, Psychologist group helped with enhanced interrogation.
The Baltimore mayor ordered police to stand down and let them loot.
In international news, Nepal earthquake. Death toll passes 6,000 with thousands still missing. Neo-Nazis plan to storm Reichstag, 70 years on. Pain still lingers 40 years after the Vietnam War. Commentary, Abe's speech in UN Congress disappoints Asian neighbors again. Yemenis in desperate need of food and fuel after weeks of airstrikes. Saudi troops killed dozens repelling Houthi attack on Yemen border crossing. In business news, digital shift puts nearly half of Australia's jobs at high risk, report warned. Tech news, after cities, smart military stations in the cards for India. In health news,
the U.S. lowers fluoride levels in drinking water for the first time in 50 years.
Almost 1/5 of Americans now take psychotropic drugs to cope with everyday life.
Green personal care products made by multinational corporations still emit toxic chemicals. Are you poisoning your house? We give you the full story.
Up first tonight in U.S. news, report, Psychologist group helped with enhanced interrogation. A report alleges that the American Psychological Association secretly worked with the Bush administration to ethically and legally justify the administration's harsh interrogation policies, which critics say amounted to torture. Waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, being slammed against walls, placed under hoods, or locked in coffin-sized boxes. In the wake of the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and subsequent invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, U.S. officials authorized the use of these and other harsh measures to extract intelligence information from prisoners, methods known as enhanced interrogation techniques to their proponents, and torture to critics. Such harsh interrogation methods, begun during the George W. Bush administration, were officially halted when President Barack Obama took office. In effect, did psychologists, they're not bound by the physician's Hippocratic Oath, which originally reads, "First do no harm, collaborate in torture." A report this week alleges, quote, the APA secretly coordinated with officials from the CIA, White House, and Department of Defense to create an APA ethics policy on national security interrogations, which comported the then classified legal guidance authorizing the CIA torture program, end quote, which states, written by 6 health professionals and human rights activists, quote, despite substantial contact between the APA, the White House, and CIA officials, including the over 600 emails noted in this report, there is no evidence that any APA official expressed concern over the mounting reports of psychologist involvement in detainee abuse during 4 years of direct email communications with senior members of the U.S. intelligence community. The report is based on 638 emails between 2003 and 2006. The lead authors of the report are psychologist Dr. Stephen Solds, an advisor for the Physicians for Human Rights Organization, Nathaniel Raymond, a director at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and Dr. Stephen Reisner, a psychological ethics advisor for Physicians for Human Rights. The bottom line for the Bush administration was that the APA's cooperation helped justify the interrogation program, allowing the U.S. Department of Justice to assert that the program was legal because it was overseen by health professionals. Investigative reporting by James Risen of the New York Times resulted in his 2014 book, Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War, in which he details similar charges regarding the APA and torture. Mr. Risen also wrote this week's Times article about the APA. The APA denies the allegations in Risen's book and article, which were based in part on the 638 emails cited in his work and subsequently analyzed by the authors of this week's report. There, quote, has never been any coordination between APA and the Bush administration on how APA responded to the controversies about the role of psychologists in the interrogation programs, end quote, Association spokeswoman Rhea Farberman told the Times. In response to Risen's book, the APA in November announced an independent review of whether there is any factual support to the assertion that the APA engaged in activity that would constitute collusion with the Bush administration to promote, support, or facilitate the use of enhanced interrogation techniques by the United States in the war on terror. That review is yet to be completed. In December, The Senate Intelligence Committee issued an unclassified summary of its 6,700-page report on the CIA's detention and interrogation program. Among other things, the report found that when subjected to these torture techniques, detainees said whatever their captives wanted to hear. This meant faulty intelligence and wasted time for U.S. intelligence officers tracking down false leads. Interrogations of detainees, quote, were brutal and far worse than the CIA claimed, the Senate reported. This, coupled with extended solitary confinement, inflicted extreme harm on people, including hallucinations, paranoia, insomnia, and attempts at self-harm and self-mutilation, the report concluded. Multiple psychologists identified the lack of human contact experienced by detainees as a cause of psychiatric problems. In response to this week's report on the APA, Physicians for Human Rights called for a Justice Department investigation. Quote, this calculated undermining of professional ethics is unprecedented in the history of U.S. medical practice and shows how the CIA torture program corrupted other institutions in our society, Donna McKay, the organization's executive director, said in a statement. Psychologists must never use their knowledge of human behavior to harm or undermine individuals. The Justice Department must look into any crimes or violations that may have been committed. It's equally critical for psychologists to reclaim the principles of the profession and to reassert the values of human rights in psychology.
Fox News is reporting that the Baltimore mayor ordered police to stand down and let them loot. Citing a senior law enforcement source who spoke with correspondent Leland Vittert, the Democratic Baltimore mayor, Stephanie Rawlings Blake, ordered police to allow rioters to loot stores Monday night, saying, let them loot. It's only property. This is coming from a very senior law enforcement official with direct knowledge of the orders that were given by the mayor and by her police commanders, down to the very core of the police riot units. Vittert said on Your World with Neil Cavuto Wednesday afternoon, what I am quoting now is from quoting the mayor. Let them loot. It's only property. He also reported that his source was very clear that on Monday night, that when stores were looted, that the police were effectively told to stand down and watch it. I was standing right here on Monday night. The police were about 75 yards up there. That's when we saw it happen. Vittert also noted that when he was covering the shooting Monday night, a Baltimore city councilman told him that he had asked police to back up so that we could talk to looters. For the full story and more, please check out tworealnews.com.
And now, in international news, Nepal earthquake. Death toll passes 6,000, with thousands still missing. This is out of The Guardian. Thousands of villages devastated, and 90% of clinics and schools in some districts unusable as Kathmandu slowly returns to normal. The death toll in the massive earthquake which struck Nepal on Saturday is past 6,000, and many thousands are still unaccounted for. A Home Ministry official said that 6,134 fatalities had been confirmed, with an additional 13,906 injured. Although the battered South Asian nation celebrated the rescue of 2 people pulled out alive from the wreckage of buildings in Kathmandu on Thursday, the sheer extent of the destruction is becoming clear. Thousands of villages have been devastated, with up to 90% of clinics and schools in some districts rendered completely unusable. Ram Charan Mahat, the Nepalese finance minister, said at least $2 billion would be needed to rebuild homes, hospitals, government offices, and historic buildings, and he appealed for help from international donors. Quote, this is just an initial estimate, and it will take time to assess the extent of damage and calculate the costs of rebuilding, Mahat said. Other estimates have been higher. Huge numbers of ancient monuments and important cultural buildings will also need to be restored if they are not demolished. Major palaces in Kathmandu have been damaged and cracked. Hundreds of thousands of people made homeless by the earthquake, which registered 7.8 magnitude, are yet to receive aid because of logistic bottlenecks, poor infrastructure, and a chaotic government response. 3,000 people are still unaccounted for in the badly hit Sindhu Palchau district, which little is known about northern areas of the Gorkha district where about 10,000 live. Local officials fear widespread destruction. A local religious leader who had flown over the zone said people were living in appalling conditions. Quote, there are still injured there who have not been treated. Whole villages are flat. They need tents very badly, Kempo Chimed Sering said. Kathmandu is slowly returning to normal, with power supplies and communication networks restored to most of the city. Quote, I think it's over now. I feel safe now, said Vivek Simdung, 20, a student in the city. However, many remain terrified of another tremor. Police have arrested 2 men for spreading rumors that a second major earthquake has been predicted. They will be charged with, quote, inciting panic among the public. Last night, watching crowds cheered as Nepalese rescuers, assisted by a U.S. disaster team, pulled a 15-year-old boy from the debris of a 7-story structure where he had reportedly stayed alive by eating jars of ghee and drinking water dripping from his clothes. Just streets away, rescuers worked into the night to free a woman from the rubble of a hotel. The teenager, named variously in reports as Pemba Tamang and Pemba Lama, was conscious and responsive, said the police officer who crawled into a gap to reach him. Quote, he thanked me when I first approached him, LB Basnet was quoted as saying. Quote, he told me his name, his address, and I gave him some water. I assured him we were near to him. The dust-covered teenager, who had been trapped in a small gap behind a bike under 2 meters of rubble, was eventually lifted, blinking into the sunlight, and placed on a stretcher with a blue brace around his neck and a drip in his arm. Libby Weiss, from an Israeli military-run medical center, said he was doing well and did not appear to have any major injuries. Quote, I don't have any logical explanation. It is miraculous. It is a wonderful thing to see in all this destruction, she said. Quote, he was under the rubble for 120 hours, and it is certainly the longest we have heard of anybody being under rubble and surviving. Quote, we understand he didn't have any food and just 2 jars of ghee, which he had at the time he was under the rubble. The second survivor was carried by stretcher to a waiting ambulance after Nepalese soldiers and a huge team of experts from France, Norway, and Israel worked to rescue her. Quote, she was injured, but she was conscious and talking, a Nepalese army major said. Quote, she has been sent to a military hospital, he said, identifying the woman as a kitchen worker in her mid-30s called Krishna Devi Kata. Quote, it is as though she had been born again. However, such stories remain rare after the Great Quake, as local media have called it. More than 11,000 people have been injured, and about 600,000 homes destroyed or damaged, the UN said. Officials said Pemba had been talking to 2 other people trapped in the rubble until early Thursday. They had gone silent. The body of a teenager was removed soon afterwards. Emergency teams have mainly been pulling bodies from the rubble. Task made all the more perilous by more than 70 aftershocks, the strongest measuring 6.9 magnitude, the Indian Meteorological Department in Delhi said. Rain has left many people with the dilemma of risking a return to damaged homes which could collapse in an aftershock, or sleeping in tents or other temporary shelters. Large numbers have left Kathmandu on free buses provided by the government, often to check on relatives in other regions. The weather has cleared up over much of the country, allowing rescue and relief missions to be stepped up. Much of the famous Khumbu Valley around Everest has been cut off by bad weather for several days. Flights have now resumed. The British and Chinese government have said they're sending additional helicopters. Anger over the slow pace of the rescue flared earlier the week with protests outside Parliament. The official death toll does not include the 19 people killed at Mount Everest, 5 foreign climbers and 14 Nepalese Sherpa when the quake caused an avalanche at base camp on the world's highest peak. The UN has launched an appeal for $415 million, and Nepal is appealing to foreign governments for more helicopters. There are widespread fears of disease in remote areas and in Kathmandu. One pharmacist in the Lalitpur area of Kathmandu immediately sold his entire stock of anti-diarrhea medication and oral rehydration salts. Neo-Nazis plan to storm the Reichstag, 70 years on. This is out of the local. Authorities said on Thursday that far right-wing activists have organized a demonstration outside Berlin's Reichstag building on March 9th, the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. Around 1,000 NPD members and sympathizers are expected to attend the rally, the Interior Ministry said in response to a parliamentary question from the opposition Link Party. One of the 2 organizers of the demonstration is a member of the far-right National Democratic Party, generally seen as a neo-Nazi organization. Online responses to the event organizers included people from across the far-right spectrum, as well as football hooligans, the ministry said. Calls to join the march against, quote, Islamization and Americanization of Germany has been circulating online for weeks, with some even calling for Parliament to be, quote, stormed. The demonstration could be a, quote, crude mixture of different shades of the far right. Berlin Counseling Against Far-Right Extremism spokesman Sebastian Werhan told the local he expects that so-called Reich citizens, who claim that the German Empire still exists and has remained under Allied occupation since 1945, and neo-Nazis will form the bulk of the demonstrators. Quote, this is an attempt to lay claim to the interpretation of this historic date. Hopefully many people will demonstrate in memory of Liberation Day and of the victims of National Socialism. Pain still lingers 40 years after the Vietnam War. This is out of the Brunei Times. This city, once known as Saigon, was festooned with red banners on Thursday that read, Long live the glorious party of Vietnam. 40 years after communist forces seized control of the country, and America walked away from a divisive and bloody war that remains a painful sore. Thousands of Vietnamese, including war veterans in uniform, lined up to watch soldiers and traditional performers parade through the streets of what is now Ho Chi Minh City. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled into Saigon, then the capital of South Vietnam. They crashed through the gates of the presidential palace and hoisted the communist flag. It was an incredible victory for the revolutionary forces that had waged guerrilla warfare for more than a decade against the United States, and before that, against France. Quote, the tank crashing the gates was a symbol of victory for the Vietnamese nation and the Vietnamese People's Army, marking the end of the 30 years of national resistance against the French and then the Americans, said Nguyen Van Tap, 64, who drove Tank 390 through the iron bars and reunited with members of his tank company Wednesday. For the Vietnamese, April 30th is a day of festivities and national reunification. For the U.S. and its South Vietnamese allies, the day was one of panic, chaos, and defeat, known simply as the fall of Saigon. Some 58,000 Americans were killed in the war, along with 250,000 South Vietnamese allies and an estimated 3 million communist fighters and civilians. Quote, we lost, and I felt that way for a long time, said Kevin Maloney, one of the last Marines out. Quote, I was ashamed that we left people behind like that. I did what I could, so I'm satisfied with my own performance. But as a nation, I think we could have done better, and I hope we can learn from that. But I don't think we've seen that. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled the South in the days and years following the war, with many taking rickety boats in search of freedom. The majority ended up resettling in the United States. Many have since come home to visit family and to invest in the country, but some have remained feverishly anti-communist and have refused to return as long as the one-party government is in power. The country still tightly controls the press and cracks down on political dissidents. It jails those who dare to speak out for democracy, including in blogs on the internet. But much has changed since the early days after the war, when Vietnam was plunged into severe poverty and isolation during failed collective farming policies. The U.S. normalized relations with Vietnam in 1995. More than 16,000 Vietnamese students now study in America, and the U.S. has become one of Vietnam's biggest foreign investors. Bilateral trade exceeded $36 billion last year. Today, Ho Chi Minh City is alive with capitalism. Many of the scars of the war are no longer visible on the surface. It is the economic muscle of the country, and recent and ongoing construction projects have transformed its skyline into glassy high-rises bathed in neon lights. But much of the old traditions remain. The sidewalks are still filled with generations of families hustling out of small shops to earn money. Commentary. Abe's speech in UN Congress disappoints Asian neighbors again. This is out of Xinhua Net. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's address in the U.S. Congress could be seen as historic in the way that Japan would no longer offer heartfelt apology to Asian neighbors victimized by its brutal aggression and colonial rule during World War II. Abe claimed that the post-war path Japan has been pursuing is based on deep remorse over the war, and Japan's actions brought suffering to the peoples in Asian countries. Quote, "We must not avert our eyes from that. I will uphold the views expressed by the previous prime ministers in this regard," he told a joint session of U.S. Congress. In such a well-prepared speech delivered to U.S. lawmakers, Abe, however, unveiled his historical revisionism ideology by using, quote, "actions" instead of, quote, "aggression and colonial rule," and, quote, "deep remorse" rather than, quote, "heartfelt apology," in an apparent effort to dilute the country's wartime atrocities. Abe's planned statement on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II this summer has already triggered concerns from neighboring China and South Korea, since the hawkish leader hinted that he will not repeat such keywords used by his predecessors. It is also giving clearer clues about what Abe will talk about months later at home. With applause in the U.S. Capitol, Abe believes he has got Washington's acquiescence in his high-profile address to cripple the much-recognized 1995 Murayama Statement. What should top the U.S. agenda in Asia is to encourage Japan to reconcile with its neighbors rather than indulge in its pivot to Asia in an irresponsible way and further embolden the right-leaning Abe government, either intentionally or unintentionally. Such miscalculations will risk peace and stability in the entire region, and escalating tensions between Japan and its neighbors will also jeopardize U.S. interests. The Japanese leader must also understand that Japan, as a country that inflicted tremendous pain and damage to Asia during World War II, should first seek reconciliation with its Asian neighbors. Unfortunately, the two allies are heading in a direction misguided by a newly revised defense guideline, which will allow Abe to upgrade Japan's self-defense forces to handle disputes with its neighbors and meddle in regional affairs in a saber-rattling way. Without offering an apology, Japan lost another chance to mend ties with its neighbors, thus clouding the future in East Asia. Yemenis in desperate need of food and fuel after weeks of airstrikes. This is out of the New York Times. In one of Yemen's largest cities, residents have been reduced to a diet of rice. In another, they sleep overnight in lines waiting for gasoline. Hospitals may soon be forced to close. Bombs and shells are raining down ever more thickly and randomly, and in places, snipers target anyone brave or desperate enough to walk the streets. 5 weeks after the start of the Saudi-led bombing campaign, more than 1,000 Yemenis have died in the fighting, and the United Nations says that at least 300,000 people have been displaced, forced to hunt for food and fuel in a country bereft of both. Fierce fighting in the port city of Aden has killed dozens of people in the last few days, left neighborhoods in flames, and set off a panicked exodus. On Thursday, little more than a week after Saudi Arabia said it was shifting the focus of its military operations in Yemen to make way for political negotiations and humanitarian relief, residents of the capital, Sana'a, were subjected to some of the heaviest airstrikes since the bombing began. The worsening humanitarian crisis, a deepening civil war that threatens to inflame the regional struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and little evidence that either side is winning and seriously pursuing negotiations, have raised stark questions about the strategic goals of the Saudi-led military campaign and the international response. Quote, "It's insanity. Here are 25 million people in the middle of this conflict," said Nuha Abdul-Jabbar, a humanitarian coordinator for Oxfam, a British charity. "The combatants," she added, "are, quote, condemning the whole country to die. Indeed, this week, coalition warplanes bombed at least 2 airports to prevent an Iranian plane from landing. The strikes damaged a runway that was being used for international aid deliveries, and the fighting, as well as a naval cordon set up by the coalition, is blocking deliveries of fuel and food by sea to a country that depends critically on imports. Under heavy international pressure, including from the United States, the Saudis announced last week that they were ending the first phase of their military campaign against the Houthis, a northern Yemeni rebel group that has captured large parts of the country over the last 8 months, including Sana'a. But instead of scaling back the airstrikes, the coalition has broadened them, demonstrating what appears to be a determination to defeat the Houthis rather than any inclination to negotiate with the group, which is allied with Iran, Saudi Arabia's regional rival. They have also started more aggressively supplying weapons to the Houthis' adversaries, according to fighters in Aden and Taiz, even though these weapons have frequently ended up in the hands of Houthis or profiteers. Saudi Arabia has threatened a ground invasion of Yemen, but faced difficulties persuading allies to provide troops for such an operation. Instead, analysts said, the Saudis were likely to intensify their efforts to support proxy forces in Yemen, a strategy they have used before. A Reuters article on Wednesday quoted a Yemeni official saying the Saudis had trained hundreds of Yemeni tribesmen to fight the Houthis, though Saudi officials did not confirm the report. For their part, the Houthis and their allies, forces loyal to Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president, have also brushed off negotiations in favor of expanding their bloody offensive aimed at controlling strategic cities. And the government of President Abdu Rabu Mansur Hadi, whom the Saudis have promised to restore to power, remains outside Yemen, trying to influence events from hundreds of miles away in the Saudi capital, Riyadh. While the fighting rages, the civilians suffer. On Tuesday, the Saudi-led coalition struck near a military base in Sana'a that residents said had already been bombed dozens of times over the last month. Airstrikes in the area on April 20th set off a huge explosion that flattened much of the nearby residential area, killing at least 36 people and wounding hundreds. Residents picking through the debris were still in shock days later, after the bombing had been eclipsed by more battles and bloodshed. Hussein Mahdi Hauben, a 25-year-old student, said the blast had blown out the doors and windows of his apartment and sent him flying through the air. Covered in blood and dust, he stumbled outside to find that the explosion had brought buildings and utility poles down on top of families. Quote, I saw my neighbors crying, screaming, he said. The Houthis' attempt to capture Aden and Taiz, Yemen's third largest city, have taken a crushing toll on residents. Witnesses said the Houthis had all but demolished the Khor Maksar neighborhood in central Aden over the last few days, ordering locals to leave and then blowing up houses with tank fire. Houthi fighters also occupied a hospital in the neighborhood as patients and doctors fled, according to residents and aid workers. As sections of Aden were reduced to rubble, supplies dwindled for survivors. Quote, lunch is rice, dinner is rice, said Faris al-Shuwabi, a Khor Maksar resident. Rice is the main meal. In Taiz, northwest of Aden, the Houthi and Saleh forces have been accused of using similarly indiscriminate force, hitting at least 2 hospitals during clashes. The number of Yemenis fleeing the combat is sharply increasing, the United Nations said this week. Its estimate of 300,000 people displaced within the country doubled in just 11 days. Yemenis on the run are finding fewer and fewer places untouched by the war. The shortages of fuel and food are crippling Taiz and Aden, as well as Sana'a and other northern areas. Shipments to Yemen have been blocked by the fighting at its ports, including Aden, and by the naval cordon imposed by the Saudi-led coalition, which inspects all shipments according to shipping industry analysts. Several fuel tankers are believed to be offshore, waiting to dock in Hodeidah. It was unclear if the coalition was stopping them or if they were standing off for other reasons, including their safety, the analysts said. In Sana'a, people seeking fuel are waiting in line for days. People sleep at the gas stations, said Marie-Claire Fegali, a spokeswoman for the International Committee of the Red Cross who is based in Sana'a. The fuel shortage has set off a, quote, vicious circle of suffering, she said. Yemen, which imports 90% of its food, has received hardly any food shipments in the last 5 weeks. Without fuel, there is no way to transport what little food is available. In a nation already severely short of water, water pumps depend on fuel to operate, so do power generators, and the cold storage areas for medicines and vaccinations in hospitals. The Yemeni authorities said this week that they might have to shut down the telecommunications network as well, further isolating a population that is increasingly cut off from the world. One city seemed to be escaping the worst of the crisis, the southern port of Al-Mukalla, which had been controlled by the local al-Qaeda branch since early April. The militants have focused on security, and the city has been administered by a council of residents and tribal leaders under their supervision. Though fuel is in short supply, there have been no lines at bakeries, and the shops are still stocked with food, said Faris bin Halabi, a local businessman. Dairy products have been arriving overland from Oman, and other essentials have come from Saudi Arabia, Mr. Halabi said. The coalition authorities have allowed at least one shipment to dock in the port with a load of sugar, and a shipment of wheat from Ukraine is on the way. Sana'a has not been as lucky. On Thursday, after workers had repaired the runway at the international airport so flights could resume, the Saudi-led coalition bombed the airport again. Saudi troops killed dozens repelling Houthi attack on Yemen border crossing. This is out of Russia Today. Saudi ground forces deployed at the Yemen border, supported by the Air Force, have successfully repelled a massive attack by Houthi rebels on a border crossing, Riyadh has announced, saying that dozens of hostile elements were killed. In a statement issued by the Saudi Defense Ministry, Riyadh claims that the country's ground forces, quote, repelled an attack carried out by groups of Houthi militias and their supporters in the border sector of Najran. The Houthis reportedly tried to capture border and control posts in Najran when Saudi forces engaged attackers with direct and indirect fire. The Saudi Air Force also came to the rescue, targeting the rebels' military hardware. Quote, with the grace of God, our gallant forces managed to defeat the hostile evil elements, the Saudi press agency wrote. At least 3 Saudi servicemen were killed, according to the report, while taking out at least a dozen Houthi fighters. The Saudi side did not share the exact number of attackers, but the information release indicated that a large, full-blown attempt to attack Saudi positions. In a separate incident, a border guard was killed by a shell, bringing the number of Saudi casualties in the 5-week campaign to 14, Reuters reported. Since the beginning of the airstrike campaign in Yemen, the Saudis have managed to fortify their border with artillery, tanks, and hilltop lookouts, and have stationed at least 15,000 troops in the desert and mountain border areas. In early April, Riyadh announced that some 500 rebels had died in sporadic border clashes with the Saudi forces. Although the first stage of the Saudi operation in Yemen, aimed at destroying first-priority targets from the air, has recently ended, Riyadh continues to control Yemeni airspace. Earlier this week, Saudi Arabia bombed the runway in Yemeni capital Sana'a to stop an Iranian flight, reportedly packed with humanitarian goods, from landing there. The damage caused to the runway has stopped the delivery of aid to the capital. Saudi actions that have hampered the delivery of vital aid to the country are a very serious violation of international standards, said Farhan Haq, deputy spokesman for the UN Secretary General, according to the TASS. He urged the Saudi-led coalition to let all aid into the country. At the same time, United Nations World Food Program asked the warring parties to allow urgently needed fuel and food into the country. Quote, this is a country where half the population are considered food insecure, meaning that many families do not know where their next meal will come from, said Purnima Kashyap, WFP representative. And now in business news, digital shift puts nearly half of Australia's jobs at high risk, report warns. This is out of the Sydney Morning Herald. Nearly half of the jobs in Australia are at high risk of digital disruption in the next 20 years, and our education system is not equipping students with the skills needed to adapt, a new report warns. PricewaterhouseCoopers Chief Executive Luke Sayers is calling for an international summit on the issue, saying universities need to start producing far more people literate in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics subjects, STEM, to help the workforce adapt to a rapidly changing global economy. PwC's report, The STEM Imperative, Future-Proofing Australia's Workforce, warns that many of the jobs people work in today, quote, simply won't exist in the next decade, either entirely or at the same number. The report's modeling shows the top 3 occupations in Australia most at risk of being automated in the next 2 decades, which are accountants, cashiers, and administration workers, affecting more than 600,000 workers in all. The least likely are doctors, nurses, and teachers. The report says Australia is lagging behind its peers in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development on a number of key STEM indicators. It says that from 1992 to 2012, there was an 11% fall in Year 12 participation for intermediate mathematics, 10% for biology, 5% for chemistry, and 7% for physics. Enrollments and completions in university STEM courses have remained flat over the period of 2001 to 2013, while non-STEM courses have grown steadily. It says about 44%, or 5.1 million jobs, are at high risk of being affected by the computerization over the next 20 years, and 75% of the fastest-growing occupations will now require STEM skills. The report shows that shifting just 1% of the workforce into STEM roles would add $57.4 billion in gross domestic product over 20 years. Mr. Sayers says that while there are already great initiatives to boost students' interests and skills in STEM, business, government, and higher education needed to channel people's efforts, energies, and investments in a much more meaningful way. Quote, we need to come together through some sort of STEM summit and put all the various parties' thoughts, ideas, and perspectives into a melting pot, he said. Within that, there will be responsibilities for government, the right policy settings, tax flow-ons, capital-related issues, as well as things for the education departments and things for businesses to do. During a panel discussion for the report's launch on Thursday, Liberal MP Wyatt Roy said Australia needed to encourage young people to become entrepreneurs and develop the right policy environment to keep homegrown startups from going overseas. Labour MP Tim Watts, who is writing a book on the economic implications of the digital revolution with Labour MP Claire O'Neill, said modern societies needed to incorporate computational thinking into their educational systems from the earliest stages. We shouldn't think that STEM subjects are a standalone silo, Mr. Watts said. We need computational thinking to be a part of all Australian students' education. If you look at the United Kingdom, they have incorporated computational thinking into their curriculum, making it mandatory for all students from year 1. PwC's report was prepared with help from the Center of Policy Studies at Victoria University. And now, in tech news, after cities, smart military stations in the cards for India. This is out of the Times of India. On the lines of government's Smart City project, the Indian military could develop its own smart stations. According to military sources, the Chiefs of Staff Committee is discussing a proposal to develop, quote, Smart Armed Forces Stations, SAFs. A former proposal will be submitted to the government soon on SAFs, they said. In the first phase, the plan is to develop 6 military stations into smart stations, along with lines of smart cities that the government is proposing to develop. The Union Cabinet on Wednesday approved Modi government's flagship scheme to develop 100 smart cities. Sources said the military leadership will propose to convert 6 military stations to SAFs. Of them, 3 will be Army stations, 2 Air Force, and 1 Navy. Under the Smart City scheme, each city selected through a City Challenge competition would get central assistance of 100 crore rupees per year for 5 years. To begin, about 20 cities would be selected from across India. The military proposal could include a suggestion to develop the 6 of them at a far cheaper cost than civilian cities. Military stations have generally better infrastructure and are easier to manage for converting them into smart cities, one officer pointed out. Another plan the armed forces will pursue is to dovetail development of its stations located in these cities selected for smart city projects. And in health news,
the U.S. lowers fluoride levels in drinking water. Will it really make a difference? The controversial fluoride debate has been raging on for quite some time. It seems that today is the day for those who have been passionately fighting for the right to have fluoride removed from water supplies declare a victory. Today, the government decided to lower the recommended amount of fluoride added to drinking water for the first time in more than 50 years. They have finally admitted that the decrease is due to people already receiving too much of a daily intake of fluoride. Because fluoride is present in many sources, people are inadvertently poisoning themselves and causing health problems. Perhaps the government's change of heart is because after years of protests, the medical community recently admitted they were wrong about fluoride altogether. Recent medical studies that have come out indicate that fluoride has been shown to reduce fertility, damage bones, and reduce IQ, especially in children. All of that changed today. The final rule was issued Monday. 4 years after it was proposed, the long-awaited regulation advises towns and cities to maintain fluoride levels at 0.7 milligrams per liter, setting the level at the lowest end of the government's previous recommended range, which was between 0.7 to 1.2 milligrams per liter. Will this make a difference? Although this minor victory should be celebrated, this harmful mineral is still present in many sources that we ingest and begs the question if it will really make that much of a difference. Not only do we have fluoride present in our municipal water supplies and our toothpaste, but we also ingest this harmful mineral from processed foods made with fluorinated water, bottled drinks, Teflon pans, and even mechanically deboned chicken. Among other things, infant formula even has fluoride added to it. For the full story and more, please check out tworealnews.com.
Almost 1/5 of Americans now take psychotropic drugs to cope with everyday life. This is out of Natural News. The results of the annual Gallup Healthways Well-Being Index are in, and the methods by which many Americans now cope with their daily lives in this brave new world are sobering. Roughly 1 in 5 individuals living in the United States, based on a random survey of people living in all 50 states in the District of Columbia, now take some type of mood-altering drug or medication daily just to make it through their miserable lives. After conducting interviews with at least 450 residents of each U.S. state between January and December 2014, researchers found that about 20% of folks, on average, use pharmaceutical pills or other substances on a day-to-day basis to feel happy or stable. Each individual was asked, open-ended, whether or not he or she uses drugs that affect your mood or help you relax, and about 1 in 5 answered yes. The types of drugs people use to this end were not specified, and may include both legal medication like pharmaceuticals, alcohol, and nicotine, as well as various illegal substances. The worst state with the most drug use was West Virginia at 28.1%, followed closely by Rhode Island at 25.9%, Kentucky at 24.5%, and Alabama at 24.2%. Meanwhile, the states with the lowest rates of daily mood-altering drug use were found to be Alaska with 13.5%, Wyoming at 15.5%, and California at 15.8%. Most of the states with the lowest rates of drug use are located in the western U.S. In fact, while the states with the highest rates of drug use are in the southern U.S. Quote, nationally, 18.9% of Americans report using mood-altering substances nearly every day, while the majority, 62.2%, say they never use such drugs, reports Gallup. About 2 in 10 Americans report using drugs or medication rarely or sometimes. Southern states that oppose natural cannabis openly embrace synthetic painkiller pharmaceuticals. Interestingly, states where naturally mood-stabilizing and pain-killing cannabis is legal either recreationally or medically, or both, have some of the lowest rates of daily drug use, according to the survey. These include California, where medical cannabis has been legal since 1996, Alaska, where recreational cannabis was recently legalized alongside medical cannabis, and Colorado, where both recreational and medical cannabis are now legal. Meanwhile, conservative Bible Belt states of the Deep South, where cannabis is still almost uniformly prohibited, have some of the highest rates of drug use, both legal and illegal. These include West Virginia, Kentucky, Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi, all of which still treat liberty as it pertains to cannabis use and cultivation with ironic disdain. Quote, southern states make up 6 of the top 10 highest drug use states, while Alaskans, Wyomingites, and Californians are least likely to say they use such drugs almost daily, reports Gallup. More than 1 in 5 residents of Kentucky, Alabama, Louisiana, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Missouri, headquarters of Monsanto, report using a drug or medicated substance to alter their mood or relax on a near-daily basis. The evident hypocrisy of the control-obsessed South in prohibiting natural cannabis while embracing synthetic painkillers and psychotropic pharmaceuticals is astounding, but it just goes to show how urgently prohibition needs to be abolished for the betterment of society, as states that are furthering along and ending the failed war on drugs clearly have lower rates of drug use almost across the board, while those that still believe they're doing God's work by criminalizing a plant have some of the highest rates of drug use in the country.
This out of natural news. Think those home cleaning and personal care products you've been using are good for the environment and healthy for your body? Looks like it's time to think again. After recent findings from University of Melbourne researchers, they demonstrated that many of these green products aren't necessarily so safe after all. In fact, they're downright toxic, emitting hazardous carcinogenic chemicals into the air you breathe. Dr. Ann Steinman, a world expert on air quality and environmental pollutants as relates to health, says that just because something is labeled as organic, natural, or green doesn't mean that it is. Steinman, who is a professor of civil engineering and the chair of sustainable cities from the Department of Infrastructure Engineering at Melbourne School of Engineering, led this particular study. Labels are not required to tell the full story. She explains that many people face a lack of information about the products they're using. This is understandable, as many companies aren't under any pressure to create safer products. Since the United States doesn't have regulations requiring a full listing of ingredients on a consumer product, they don't have to. Using the word fragrance is sufficient enough to convey a hodgepodge of chemicals that go into making many common household and personal care products. When it comes to laundry detergents, air fresheners, and cleaning supplies, not only do labels not have to list all ingredients, but they don't even need to mention that there's a fragrance included in the product. Steinman says that to avoid such issues, people often gravitate towards what they think are healthier choices for themselves and for the environment. But what they don't know is that many products labeled as natural and organic are simply claims that are largely untested. Talk about not feeling very reassured about choosing supposed green products, right? Steinman decided to test the products for herself. She assessed volatile organic compounds across 37 different products ranging from air fresheners and laundry supplies to personal care products, some of which carry the green or organic claims and some did not. Additionally, she compared fragrance-free products with fragranted ones. The study, titled Volatile Emissions from Common Consumer Products, was published in the Journal for Air Quality, Atmosphere, and Health. Its abstract states, this study found 156 different VOCs emitted from the 37 products, with an average of 15 VOCs per product. Of these 156 VOCs, 42 VOCs are classified as toxic or hazardous under U.S. federal laws, and each product emitted has at least one of these chemicals. Emissions of carcinogenic hazardous air pollutants from green fragranted products were not significantly different from regular fragranted products. The most common chemicals in fragranted products were terpenes, which were not in fragrance-free versions. Despite this unsettling news, there are ways to create a safer home environment. Obviously, the fewer products that are used, the better. In other words, if it's not necessary to use several products to clean a tub, then don't. One should be sufficient. Also consider bypassing sprays designed to make your home smell like a tropical paradise meadow. They are undoubtedly a bottle of Franken fragrances. Most people are also aware that proper ventilation helps prevent indoor air pollution from accumulating. Consider opening windows as often as possible, even when you aren't using cleaning products. Purchasing plants that help improve air quality is also a great idea. English ivy, snake plants, spider plants, and Chinese evergreens are just a few that fight air pollutants while boosting oxygen levels in the air. This and more you can find at tworealnews.com.
And now for our
Quote of the day.
quote, nobody can give you freedom. Nobody can give you equality or justice or anything. If you are a man, you take it. Malcolm X. That's going to wrap it up for tonight's broadcast. Be sure to stay updated with the live news feed, original articles, and much more on tworealnews.com. Thank you for joining us. God bless you. Good night.